In the valleys of South Wales, the mountains were not made by God. They were made by men. On the morning of the 21st of October 1966, one of those mountains began to move. Within minutes, 116 children and 28 adults were dead. Aberfan sat deep in the Taff Valley, a close-knit mining village of roughly 5,000 souls. Stone terraces climbing the hillside, slate roofs dark with rain, the constant fine black dust of the colliery settling on every windowsill. Above it rose Merthyr Mountain, and on that mountain the National Coal Board had built its own peaks. Tip after tip of colliery waste, loose, black, uncompacted. For decades the waste from Merthyr Vale Colliery had been hauled up the steep eastern slope and tipped without proper drainage or site investigation. Tip number 7 was the newest, started in 1958. By the autumn of 1966, it stood 111 feet high. Nearly 300,000 cubic yards of loose material stacked on ground that had always seeped with underground springs. It loomed directly above Pantglas Junior School and the houses along Moy Road. Every weekday morning, the children of Aberfan walked to school under its shadow. They knew the tips were part of the landscape. Most had never known a time without them. The mountain was man-made. The danger was real. And almost no one with the power to stop it treated that danger as serious. The ground under Tip 7 was never suitable. Natural springs rose from the porous Brithdaer sandstone. They were marked on the Ordnance Survey maps. Anyone walking the mountainside before tipping could see the streams and the wet ground. In 1944, Tip 4 had already slid, a major flow slide that left a clear scar still visible years later. Between 1947 and 1951, Tip 5 also moved. Then in 1963, Tip 7 itself slipped. A rotational failure followed by a flow of wet material. A large hollow appeared in the face of the tip. The toe advanced. Locals saw it. Aerial photographs later proved it. From July 1963, the Merthyr Tydfil Borough Council began writing letters. The heading was clear: danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of the Pantglas schools. They warned of flooding. They warned of movement. They warned that the tip could threaten the school. The National Coal Board replied with reassurances. They had no tipping policy, no proper drainage, no site investigation, no systematic inspection. The warnings were noted and ignored. The mountain continued to grow. Friday, the 21st of October, 1966. The day began windless. A dense belt of mist filled the lower valley. It hid the tips completely from the village below. Up on the mountain, the tipping gang arrived just before 7:30. They found the crest of Tip 7 had sunk overnight, around 10 feet. By 8:30, the settlement had increased to nearly 20 feet. The rails had fallen into the depression. There was no telephone on the hillside. One of the men set off down the mountain on foot to report it. In the village, the school bell rang. 240 children of Pantglas Junior School walked through the mist. It was the last day before half-term. They were excited. Lessons began at 9 o'clock. Registers were being taken. Maths work was going on the board. Above them, hidden in the mist, the tip continued to settle. Before we proceed, if you're enjoying this AI reconstruction, let me know. Which disaster should we reconstruct next, and where in the world are you watching from? At approximately 9:15 that morning, the tip gave way. On the mountain, the crane driver, Gwyn Brown, was standing at the edge of the depression. He watched the wet black material rise slowly at first. Then it rose faster. It turned itself into a wave. a dark, glistening wave of liquefied coal waste. It burst from the toe of Tip 7 and raced down the mountainside, waves 20 to 30 feet high, moving at speeds estimated between 11 and 21 miles per hour. It gathered speed. Trees cracked. A tram was carried along with it. The 2 farm cottages at Pantglas were overwhelmed. The flow crossed the disused canal and the railway embankment. It fractured the water mains. The additional water only made the slurry more fluid. In the valley below, people heard a sound like a low-flying jet, or thunder, or loose trains running down an incline. Then the black wave disappeared into the mist, heading straight for the school. The black wave hit Pantglas Junior School with devastating force. It struck the classrooms that faced the mountain first. The windows exploded inward under the impact. Brick walls crumpled and collapsed under the sheer weight of the slurry. Desks, chairs, school books and children were swept across the rooms in a single crushing surge of black liquid waste. 109 of the children and 5 of their teachers died inside that building on the last day before half-term. In one classroom, the school meals clerk, Nancy Williams, threw her own body over 5 children. They lived. She did not. Rescuers later found her still clutching the dinner money she had been collecting when the tip came down. On Moy Road, 18 houses disappeared completely under the black mass. Entire families were lost in seconds. The mountain that had stood above the village for years had finally arrived in the streets. Outside, the few who could still move climbed through shattered windows and over piles of rubble and wet coal. Some teachers managed to pull a handful of children free in those first desperate moments, before a second wave of mud sealed the remaining classrooms forever. Dust filled the air. The smell of wet coal, broken timber, and wet earth hung heavy over the site. Then, suddenly, there was almost complete silence. No birds, no children playing, no school bell. Only the distant sound of water still pouring from the fractured mains high on the embankment. Within minutes of the tip coming down, the first miners arrived from Merthyr Vale Colliery. They had been working underground when the call went out. They came still black with coal dust, tools in hand, and began digging with their bare hands. Local people poured onto the site, fathers, mothers, neighbours. They brought garden tools, buckets, shovels, anything they could find. They formed long human chains, the famous bucket brigades, passing the wet black slurry back up the slope, one heavy load at a time. Fire crews and ambulances reached the village by 9:30. They described the scene as utter pandemonium. The experienced miners took control of the digging. They knew that careless excavation could bring more of the unstable tip down on everyone. The work was desperate and exhausting. Wet slurry, broken timber, school desks and rubble had to be moved by hand in the cold, wet air. By 11 o'clock that morning, the last living child was pulled free, 8-year-old Jeff Edwards. No more survivors were found after that hour. Still, the miners kept digging. They worked through the day and into the night under floodlights and rain. They were no longer looking for the living. They were digging for the dead, and many of them were looking for their own children. As the hours passed, the true scale of the loss became clear. Bethania Chapel, only a short distance from the school, was turned into a temporary mortuary. Bodies were brought in on stretchers and carefully laid on the wooden pews. Volunteers and embalmers worked without electricity or running water to clean the thick black slurry from the children so that parents could identify them. Parents waited outside in the rain, patient and silent, admitted one at a time to look for their sons and daughters. The silence that had fallen over the disaster site after the last survivor was pulled free, now settled over the entire village. No more cries for help. No more hope of finding anyone alive. only the quiet, relentless work of recovery and the unbearable task of identification. By the end of the first day, dozens of bodies had been recovered. In the days that followed, the final number became clear. 144 people had died. 116 of them were children. Almost an entire generation of Aberfan had been taken by the mountain that stood above them. In the months after the disaster, a tribunal of inquiry was set up under Lord Justice Edmund Davies. It sat for 76 days. 136 witnesses gave evidence. The transcript ran to thousands of pages. The tribunal examined every aspect of the tip complex, the previous slips of 1944 and 1963, the ignored letters of warning from the local council, and the complete absence of any tipping policy within the National Coal Board. In August 1967, the report was published. Its findings were clear and damning. Blame for the disaster rested upon the National Coal Board. This blame was shared among the board headquarters, the Southwestern Divisional Board, and certain individuals. There was a total absence of tipping policy, and this was the basic cause of the disaster. The tribunal said the disaster could and should have been prevented. It was a terrifying tale of bungling ineptitude by many men charged with tasks for which they were totally unfitted, of failure to heed clear warnings, and of total lack of direction from above. 9 individuals were named, but the greatest responsibility lay with the board itself. The mountain had been man-made. The tragedy had been entirely preventable. The tribunal did not stop at general findings. It named 9 individuals by name who bore varying degrees of responsibility for the catastrophe that struck Aberfan. Yet the deepest failure was institutional. The National Coal Board had no tipping policy, no proper site investigation, no system of inspection, no trained civil engineers overseeing the tips. Lord Justice Edmund Davies wrote that the disaster was a terrifying tale of bungling ineptitude by many men charged with tasks for which they were totally unfitted. Not of wickedness, but of ignorance, ineptitude, and a total failure of communication from above. The board had privately accepted liability even before the formal sittings of the inquiry began, yet spent many weeks publicly resisting the truth and wasting the tribunal's time. When the report was finally published in August 1967, the nation was left in no doubt. This was a man-made disaster. It could and should have been prevented. And the people of Aberfan had been failed by those who were meant to protect them. In the years that followed, the people of Aberfan fought for justice and for safety. A disaster fund was established on the day of the tragedy. It received nearly 88,000 contributions from around the world, raising £1.75 million. But even this brought further pain. The remaining tips still towered over the village. The National Coal Board and the government resisted removing them on the grounds of cost. In the end, £150,000 was taken from the disaster fund itself to help pay for the removal of the tips that still threatened the village. It was a decision that caused deep and lasting bitterness among the people of Aberfan. Only decades later, in 1997, was the money finally repaid. Out of the tragedy came new law. The Mines and Quarries Tips Act of 1969 was passed to prevent such a disaster ever happening again. For the first time, tips were properly regulated. All tips were to be regarded as potentially dangerous. The mountain that had destroyed a generation finally forced the country to change its laws. Today, the tips are gone. The mountain has been reshaped. Grass grows where the black waste once stood. But the memory of Aberfan remains. In the cemetery on the hillside, 116 children lie side by side with the teachers who died with them. Rows of white arches mark their graves. The village never fully recovered. Every year, on the 21st of October, the people of Aberfan fall silent and remember the day the mountain came down. They still live with the loss. They still live with the knowledge that it never had to happen. The disaster forced the country to change its laws. It forced the world to look differently at man-made mountains of waste. But no law, no inquiry, no amount of money can bring back the children who died that morning. What remains is the quiet village under the mountain, the memorial garden where the school once stood, and the enduring question, how many more warnings will we ignore before the next mountain comes down? If you enjoyed this AI reconstruction documentary, consider subscribing for more cinematic stories from history every week. And if there's another historical event you'd like us to reconstruct, let us know in the comments below. Until next time, thank you for watching.